The afternoon seemed calm, just like so many others that had come before it. The warm light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over the house. The quiet tranquility filled the space, wrapping it in a sense of peace and contentment. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as I did every evening, waiting for my husband Jack to return from work. My son, now 20 years old, was in the living room, absorbed in his phone. I could hear the occasional tap of his fingers on the screen, but everything else was quiet. It was a familiar scene, the routine of everyday life. Yet there was something different in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I looked at my son for a moment. He was no longer the little boy I once held in my arms, the child who needed me for everything. I could still remember the days when he was small, his wobbly steps, the sound of his laughter that could light up a room, and the way his hands always reached out for mine, seeking comfort and security. It felt like just yesterday that he was that child, and now, standing before me, he had grown into a young man, independent and self-sufficient, someone who, at times, felt like a stranger. I shook my head slightly, trying to shake off the wave of nostalgia that washed over me. It was part of life, I reminded myself. Children grow, they change, and so must we. Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. The transition from child to adult was often subtle, but inevitable. My son had his own world now, one that didn't always include me. He had his friends, his interests, his future ahead of him, and I was no longer the center of his universe. As I adjusted the oven temperature, I glanced over at him again. This time, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten, a look in his eyes that made me uneasy. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me. His gaze wasn't casual, wasn't just passing by. It was intense, almost analytical, as though he was studying me. There was something in his eyes, something that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I couldn't place it, but it made the air in the room feel heavy, charged. My heart began to beat a little faster. I tried to ignore it, pretending I hadn't noticed. I focused back on the food in front of me, stirring the pot more vigorously than necessary, trying to keep my thoughts occupied with something, anything, other than the strange feeling creeping into my chest. But despite my best efforts, the unease wouldn't go away. It lingered, thick and unsettling, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Later, when we sat down to eat, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. We talked about the usual things, his studies, his friends, the little details of the day. His voice was the same as always, casual and light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. There was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle difference in the air, and I couldn't ignore it. Jack didn't come home early that night, as he often did lately due to his workload, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my son. The dinner conversation continued, but my mind kept wandering back to that look in his eyes. After the meal, we decided to watch a movie together. It was a familiar routine, something we did to unwind after the day. A light romantic comedy that we could both laugh at and relax to. But as the movie played, my mind drifted far away from the screen. I couldn't focus. The unease that had started in the kitchen still lingered, filling my thoughts. I could hear the dialogue, but it was as though I wasn't really present. I was somewhere else, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. Then, it happened. As we laughed about a funny scene, I felt it. His hand brushed against mine, lightly, almost imperceptibly. It was such a small thing, a simple touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. It wasn't even a moment to be remembered by most people, but to me, it felt like a lightning bolt. My body tensed immediately, and my heart raced. It was irrational, ridiculous even. He was my son, but I couldn't help it. The sensation was overwhelming, and before I could stop myself, I stood up abruptly. "I'm going to get some water," I said, my voice coming out more hurried than I intended. I couldn't look at him, couldn't meet his eyes. I turned away and hurried into the kitchen, desperate for space, for distance. I needed to get away from the feelings that were rising in me, feelings I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it felt wrong, all wrong. I stood by the sink, my hands under the cold stream of water, trying to ground myself. The coldness of it helped a little, but not enough to quell the storm of emotions inside me. What was happening? Why had I reacted like that? It was absurd. He was my son. A simple brush of the hand shouldn't have felt like this, shouldn't have stirred such a deep, visceral reaction in me. I repeated over and over in my mind, "It's my son. It's just a touch." But the more I tried to reason with myself, the less I could make sense of what I had felt. I didn't know how long I stood there, just letting the water flow over my hands, trying to wash away the confusion, the discomfort, the strange, unbidden feelings. When I finally returned to the living room, I deliberately chose to sit at the far end of the couch, making sure there was a physical space between us. It wasn't just a distance of inches, it was a barrier, a clear statement that something had changed. I didn't know what to do, how to act. The silence that settled between us was thick, filled with unspoken words. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. I found him in the kitchen early, holding a cup of coffee, his demeanor completely unaffected. He greeted me as if nothing had happened, his attitude light and easy. I almost envied him for it, the way he seemed to be unaffected by the tension that had gripped me the night before. I wanted to believe it was just my overactive imagination, that I had blown things out of proportion, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I decided to suggest something familiar, something that might break the awkwardness. "How about we go for a walk?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "We could use some fresh air." To my relief, he agreed enthusiastically. It was something we used to do often, just a simple walk to clear our minds, to reconnect. Maybe this would help reset things, make everything feel normal again. We drove out to a road lined with trees, the early morning sunlight casting long shadows over the ground. As we drove, he pointed to a trail that led off the road into a small forest. "Mom, look at that. It's beautiful," he said, his voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. I smiled, touched by his excitement. I pulled over, parked the car, and we stepped out together, walking along the trail. The fresh air was invigorating, the sound of leaves crunching beneath our feet, grounding. For a moment, everything felt right again. We were just mother and son, walking through the woods, enjoying the simplicity of nature. But then, it happened again. He stopped walking and turned to face me. He was close, so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. My heart began to race again. "Mom, do you know how much you mean to me?" he whispered, his voice low and filled with a strange intensity. His eyes locked with mine, and for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar in them. There was a depth to his gaze, a weight that I couldn't ignore. My breath caught in my throat. "Of course, son. You're the most important thing to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to push away the growing panic in my chest. I took a step back, instinctively creating space between us. I needed to put distance between us, to make sure that whatever this was, it didn't go any further. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You're more than that to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I froze. The world seemed to blur around me. I couldn't breathe. I could feel my legs shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. A tear slid down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I had no idea what to say, how to respond. The words that came to mind felt inadequate, not nearly enough to explain what was happening, to explain the turmoil inside me. I had to say something. I had to make him understand. Son, our bond is unique. It's sacred. It's a pure, unconditional love that should never be confused. I will always be here for you, but there are lines we can never cross, I said, my voice cracking. It was the hardest thing I had ever said, but it was the truth. Our relationship, the love we shared, was something beautiful, but it had to stay within its boundaries. It could never become anything else. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of pain and something else I couldn't identify. Finally, he nodded, slowly, as if processing what I had said. The silence that followed was deafening. We didn't speak much on the way home. There was nothing to say. When we arrived back, he went straight to his room and shut the door. The tension between us hung in the air, thick and oppressive. That night, he didn't come out. The next morning, he told me he was leaving. I think it's better if I go. I need space. This will be better for both of us, he said calmly, almost as if he had already made up his mind. I didn't know what to say. I watched him leave, my heart breaking into pieces. I could feel the weight of the moment, the finality of it. It felt as though a part of me was leaving with him. How had we gotten here, I thought. How had this happened? All the love and care I had given him as a mother, everything I had done to protect him, to guide him, seemed to have led us to this point. Was it not enough? Had I failed him somehow? Since that day, I have thought about that moment again and again. It was a painful decision, but I knew it was the right one. We both needed space to heal, to reflect, and to understand what had happened. I trusted that, with time, we would both find our way back to each other and rebuild the bond we once had, one that was rooted in respect, in true love, and in the understanding of where the boundaries lay. I still held on to the hope that someday we would heal. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story has helped or inspired you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. On this channel, we continue to explore ideas that improve our lives, our relationships, and our overall well-being. Stay tuned for more videos. Take care, and always remember to apply the wisdom you find in your daily life.